Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. On the program this week, the Supreme Court allows asylum limitations to take effect, the latest on immigration enforcement negotiations between Mexico and the United States, and revisiting the question of TPS for Bahamians in the wake of Dorian. All that's just ahead. But before we get started, please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcasts. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. And here with me today are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hey, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramon, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hey, Cris.
Hey, Jordan. How's it going?
Good. Up first today, earlier this month, the Supreme Court stayed a nationwide injunction against one of the Trump administration's efforts to limit migrants' ability to claim asylum at the southwest border. This case deals with the administration's plans to deny asylum to migrants who have traveled through another country before reaching the United States and did not first apply for protection there. The Supreme Court is going to allow the case to proceed, but in the meantime is letting these regulations go into effect, raising questions about the impact on the immigration systems not just in the United States, but in Mexico and Central America as well. With the injunction lifted, how quickly is the Trump administration moving to put these rules into place?
Well, we think they're moving really quickly. U.S. which owns the asylum officers which conduct the interviews for asylum, issued guidance fairly quickly trying to implement when this criteria would be in place. What isn't so clear is who along the border this is being applied to. CBP encounters people first when they come across the border, either at a port of entry or between a port of entry, and they make the initial determination of whether or not somebody goes into what kind of removal proceedings. And that's where a little bit of chaos is reigning, as we might say, because they're also currently implementing the Migration Protection Protocols, or Remain in Mexico program. And these would be two separate kind of ways of treating people when they arrive. So if they go into the migration protection protocols, they would not necessarily be subject to this until they got their case heard before an immigration judge. If they're going to be placed in what's called expedited removal, then they could be interviewed by an asylum officer, in which case this ban could apply immediately, and then they would have to be deported back to where they came from. So we're getting trickled reports, mostly from immigration lawyers and advocates along the border, that there does seem to be some confusion about what process any individual is in right now. But they're trying to implement it, I guess is a way of saying it.
So what impacts can we expect here and abroad in the short term as a result of these rules taking effect?
At least abroad, it's a little bit unclear. It really depends on what the United States will be doing with individuals who are removed from the country. If it's the case that an individual is being deported back to their home country, so say it's a Salvadoran who attempted to apply for asylum at the U.S. Mexico border and they're returned back to El Salvador, it's a little bit difficult to say whether or not then they would be required or forced to apply for asylum in Mexico, just simply because they are not in Mexico and they're just being deported as they would be under any other removal procedure. If it's the case, though, that the United States starts deporting individuals back to Mexico because they did not apply for asylum in Mexico, even though they are a Salvadoran national, then I think that's where it starts getting a little more trickier, because at that point, Mexico has essentially become a de facto first entry country, but there is no mechanism with which the transfer between the United States and Mexico would happen, where Mexico then takes on the individual and makes them apply for refugee status, which is the equivalent of asylum status in the country, take them in to provide them with humanitarian protection. So at least that's where it's unclear on the impact in the region.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, this is a U.S. regulation on who is eligible to get asylum. It is not an international agreement, although it acts like a third country agreement or a first entry agreement, in that it's saying that if you've gone through another country and you haven't applied for asylum there and been denied, then you don't get an opportunity to apply here. It doesn't require Mexico to process asylum claims. There's no binding Mexico responsibility under this. And it actually doesn't require the migrant to apply for asylum in any country. It just says if you haven't, you're not going to get it here. So procedurally, it is kind of a unilateral action, but as Cris noted, it could have some international implications.
As for the U.S. asylum system, I think for all intents and purposes, depending on how it's implemented, it will affect a large number of people who are arriving at the U.S. Mexico border who are seeking asylum. It could be the case that a lot of individuals could be turned away because under the rule they did not apply for asylum through any of the countries through which they entered to reach the U.S. Mexico border. So this could potentially be really closing the door on a lot of individuals who are arriving here. And I think that's one of the reasons why the reaction to this decision has been so intense.
Yeah, I would just add one other point of clarification. We talk a lot about the Central American migrants arriving at the border, and clearly that's the large number of people. But we're also seeing migrants from lots of other places in the world that would also be implicated by this. So from African countries, from Asian countries, from Cuba. So all of them also are covered by this asylum rule. And if they came through another country to get to the U.S. Mexico border to apply for asylum, they too could be denied the chance to apply under this rule.
So if the result of this policy is more asylum applications being filed in Mexico and Northern Triangle countries, are those countries' systems well equipped to handle a greater influx of those applications?
Absolutely not. I've been talking about Mexico's asylum system on this podcast for a long time now. And essentially, their asylum system was never designed to receive large numbers of asylum seekers. Up until maybe middle of this year, they had somewhere in the ballpark of 45 to 50 asylum officers that had to make a decision about 45 to 60 days, and they're projected to get 80,000 cases this year. The situation was so dire in Mexico that they had to reach out to UNHCR to get additional staff and resources. But despite the fact that they've actually had to reach out to UNHCR, the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he initially slashed their budget last year, and now he just added, I think, a little tinkling of funding to go from a $1.2 million budget for the Mexican Asylum Agency to a whole whopping $1.5 million. And so as a result, this is just simply that they just simply don't have the capacity. And you're seeing similar issues as well in the Northern Triangle countries. So if it's the case that they're going to have to start taking more asylum seekers with this weakened capacity, I think that's just going to make the crisis a lot worse.
So, Theresa, you mentioned that these rules do apply to would-be asylum seekers from anywhere in the world, but it does have the effect of making it more difficult for those who would travel by foot to the United States rather than those who would travel to the United States by boat or plane. And some have noted that kind of disparity. Is that just a reflection of the way that most asylum claims are being filed right now, or do you see a different intent behind this policy?
Well, on its face, it's clearly an attempt to address the situation happening at the U.S. Mexico border right now, because it does not apply to anyone who arrives, for example, by plane from Asia or from Africa directly to the United States, or someone who arrives by boat. It is only for people who arrive at the U.S. Mexico border. And so clearly that is the aim, is to address the situation happening there right now. But it does create a disparity. You could have two identical people who came from two identical situations in the same country, and one would be eligible to apply for asylum even if they traveled through other countries on their flight to the United States, and another one who arrived at the U.S. Mexico border who would not. That is I think a bad consequence of this, is that you have some people who, by virtue of how they are able to get to the United States, being eligible, and some who are not. And it is worth noting that very, very few refugees and asylees, asylum seekers come through air or by sea. You have to have a certain level of means to do so. And in order to get on a plane or a boat to travel to the United States, you actually have to have travel documents. So if you are fleeing and requesting asylum from a country that you cannot get travel documents from, the chances you would be able to get on a plane or a boat to come to the United States are kind of small. So again, I think this is, it would significantly curtail our asylum system. It would curtail it in a specific way aimed at what's going on at the border now. But it's a permanent rule. Once it's in place, and it could have far-reaching impacts for how anybody could manage to get to the United States to claim asylum.
The Trump administration has treated this as a major victory in their effort to curb migration. Do you think they're right to feel that way?
It's a temporary victory. This fight went to the Supreme Court over an injunction, which is a temporary thing that was put in place to stop the rule from going forward while the actual case is making its way through the courts. And that case is still going through the courts. We don't yet know how it's going to come out. Clearly, though, the Trump administration believes that ultimately it will prevail. It has said so all along. It certainly said so when it issued the regulation. It said, we know we're going to be sued, but we also believe that it will get to the Supreme Court and we'll win. So, yeah, they have a short-term victory. It may or may not stay as the rest of the court cases move through the process.
The only thing I can add to that is the reaction from immigration advocates has been interesting. Obviously, they criticize the decision, but I'm starting to notice more of them beginning to recognize the limitations of their litigation against the administration strategy. And it's starting to dawn on them that potentially this whole approach that they've been using, that they're dealing potentially with a Supreme Court that may not be aligned with what they believe or what they think the immigration law, the way it should be enforced and applied. And so I think that it's going to be interesting to sort of see how advocates move forward with thinking about litigation as the principal tool to fight the administration with.
On that note, I would just say that the initial case, the one that went to the Supreme Court, was filed by a bunch of groups challenging the rule itself on legal grounds, whether or not the rule was legal. There was just another suit filed in California today with, I think, 135 individual plaintiffs, asylum applicants, that made a different argument that the implementation of this rule did not give them a fair chance to understand the rules under which they were applying. So it's a procedural litigation. This, to me, does indicate a little bit of a shift in strategy. They're not attacking the rule per se. They're attacking how it was implemented, and in this case, with individuals who have been affected by it.
Okay, after a quick break, the latest on U.S. Mexico immigration negotiations. On September 10th, U.S. and Mexican diplomats held an important bilateral meeting on immigration enforcement. The goal was to address the status of Mexico's efforts to curb unauthorized migration at its own southern border, and observers on both sides were watching to see if Mexico would commit to further actions beyond its migration clampdown and its cooperation with the United States on the Remain in Mexico policy. Cris, what led to these discussions between the two governments?
So this discussion is basically a status update between both governments on agreements that they signed earlier this summer about how to approach the influx of migrants arriving at the U.S. Mexico border and who are entering into Mexico between the Mexican and Guatemalan border. If you remember earlier this summer, that whole discussion came about because President Trump threatened Mexico with tariffs and potentially other types of economic threats unless they did something more on the arrivals of Central Americans and other migrants from other regions to the U.S. Mexico border. He wanted more to be done. And so basically what ended up happening is that the Mexican government under Manuel López Obrador, he basically sent his foreign minister to the United States to engage into a discussion. And essentially what was agreed to is that Mexico was going to be doing a lot more on enforcement. And so since then they've taken a whole host of enforcement actions that have in some ways shown that there's have been effective in dropping the number of individuals arriving at the U.S. Mexico border. So this discussion really was sort of saying, okay, let's see where the enforcement actions are. Let's assess the situation. Let's see whether or not there are additional areas that the U.S. and Mexico need to pursue in order to continue building on what's already been done.
So the discussions revealed some fault lines over Mexico's willingness to make further commitments to the United States. What came out of the discussions, and what did it show you about whether the Mexican government intends to keep cooperating with the Trump administration's approach?
So two things that I think emerged. I would say, like, if you were looking at where there was praise, certainly both the Mexican government and President Trump praised the Mexican government for doing a lot more on enforcement, for sending in additional enforcement troops down at the Guatemalan Mexican border and doing a lot more to be able to drop the numbers of apprehensions at the U.S. Mexico border. That really was pretty positive between both governments, and there was a lot of high-fiving all around, if you can put it that way. But I think what is more interesting is this. that the U.S. wanted Mexico to do more. They wanted those apprehension numbers at the U.S. Mexico border to be even lower than they already are. And the thing is that this is where I think there was tension, because Mexico is saying, look, we're doing enough. We're going to keep doing more. We're actually going to expand more cooperation with Remain in Mexico through the migration protection protocols. We're going to do a little bit more of that. But what we won't do is sign a first entry agreement with the United States. Obviously, as we were talking about in the first segment of this podcast, that decision, I think, has been impacted a little bit by the Supreme Court decision on this new asylum ban regulation. But, more broadly, Mexico said we're not going to do more on this specific area. We won't receive more asylum seekers. We won't try to process them. And I think that this is really the key tension point, because at a certain point, Mexico is only going to do so much, and it's going to really fall on the United States to start thinking, what are some alternative ways that we can deal with the arrivals of migrants that don't necessarily involve Mexico being involved in this?
Yeah, and I would just add that from Mexico's point of view, everything that's been happening so far, Remain in Mexico, they see those people that are coming back to Mexico as temporary stays, that once their case is decided, and they've pushed the United States to speed up those cases. So we're now seeing the port courts, for example, at Laredo and in Texas, where they're by remote via video teleconferencing with immigration judges adjudicating the cases of the MPP participants to speed them up. And that's something Mexico wants, because once that case is decided, presuming it's negative, or even if it is positive, then that person becomes the responsibility of the United States, no longer of Mexico. So Mexico doesn't see the Remain in Mexico policy as permanently impacting them. But if they were to take on additional responsibilities for people removed back to Mexico from the United States, or people applying for asylum, that would have more implications for Mexico.
Cris, what are the challenges for Mexico's president in navigating the domestic politics on this issue? How is he being viewed at home on immigration policy?
So the key issue is, I think, that there is a significant percentage of the Mexican public that wants a lot more done on enforcement of the arrival of migrants into Mexico. There have been a variety of polls from Mexican news outlets that have really shown that the Mexican public is very much in favor of stopping the arrivals of migrants from Central America and other regions. You've been hearing news reports about unfortunately, some xenophobic riots or actions against African migrants in Mexico. So if you're looking at the whole domestic, situation there, it really is that they want, AMLO to do a lot more. And it's interesting because he's making a pivot where he initially, when he entered into his presidency, that he wanted a humanitarian approach to immigration, which meant, for instance, building on what Mexico had already been doing, which is, granting more asylum, or at least more asylum statuses to individuals arriving there, but by expanding the humanitarian visa program, which allows individuals to stay there temporarily and work temporarily and so forth. He went from that to something that's much more hard line. And so right now, the tricky balance is sort of trying to obviously not only deal with the Trump administration that wants more on enforcement, but sort of addressing this internal tension from his initial position of having a more humanitarian approach on immigration to one now that's much more hard line and much more in line, I think, where the Mexican public stands. But I think that as long as the Mexican public really wants a lot more done, he's not necessarily in the wrong politically to kind of try to continue pursuing this strategy, especially if it shows strength to the Mexican public that he's doing more on immigration.
All right, up next, immigration policy in the wake of natural disasters. After days of mixed messaging, the administration indicated it would not extend this status, prompting sustained criticism from Democrats and immigration advocates. But there's also quite a bit of misinformation around what that TPS designation would entail and who would be impacted. We've covered TPS broadly on the program before, but not in this specific context. What's the usual course of action on TPS designation in the wake of major natural disasters?
So usually the process is such that The government looks at what has happened. Perhaps there's a request from the government where the disaster happened to the United States government to grant temporary protected status to individuals in the United States from that country. Sometimes it comes from advocacy groups. Sometimes it comes from Congress, in which case the government takes a look at the number of people it believes are in the United States at the time from that country, what status they may have, and what the capacity would be for that country to return them, to receive them if they were to return. The government makes a decision on all of these things, usually gets information from State Department and other parts of the government, and then makes a determination, and it's in the authority of the Secretary of Homeland Security to do this designation of a country for temporary protected status. What that means is that upon the designation, individuals who are in the country, already in the United States from that country, are eligible to stay and remain for the duration of the designation. Usually it's a year, 18 months or so, and can get work authorization if they don't already have a status. It does not provide them a permanent status in the United States. It is available to individuals who don't have status, who are undocumented at the time the designation happens. They can still apply. They have to meet certain criteria, show that they're not, don't have a criminal background, etc. But and this status can be renewed. So when the first designation comes up, the government can look at that and decide whether to extend the designation for those already in the program. They can reissue or redesignate a country, which has the effect of bumping that date forward of people who are in the country who are eligible. But that's the normal process.
Do you have a sense that the White House broke from prior precedent in this case? And what reasoning did they give in their definitive statement explaining why they weren't going to be extending TPS?
So when you ask about prior precedent, are you talking about prior precedent in this administration or previous administrations? Because I would say that this administration has broke prior precedent on TPS generally, not just the case of the Bahamas. They did not designate the Bahamas. And I think previous administrations of either party clearly would have, because if you look at the original designations for many countries, it was in the wake of exactly this kind of natural disaster where major portions of the infrastructure of the country are just decimated, that there is nothing for people to go home to if they were to return. There's no capacity to receive them. There's no transportation or electricity. Previous cases involved, for example, a volcanic eruption on the island nation of Montserrat, and we designated TPS for those nationals. There have been hurricanes in Central America that resulted in designations for decades, Haiti, and earthquakes. So this is exactly the kind of thing that previous administrations would have done. But this administration has viewed TPS very differently, because many of those previous designations, including for those for Central America, were initially designated on the basis of a natural disaster and then extended literally for decades on other bases, that the country just simply didn't work well, or it wasn't good, or it would be bad to return people who'd been here that long. So this administration really views TPS as having a system that has been abused, and they have moved to terminate almost all of the countries that have been participant in TPS as of the date this administration came up. Before Bahamas, there was a push, and there still is a push, to try to grant temporary protected status to Venezuela, for Venezuelans who are in the United States. There's a political bent to that one. This administration clearly sees the existing situation in Venezuela as a challenging one, has supported the opposition government, and yet won't use TPS designation that has authority to do so. And Congress is looking at mandating that by statute. But I would say that the decision on the Bahamas was consistent with the Trump administration's attitudes toward temporary protection status, but does represent a departure from prior administrations.
Why was there so much confusion over both what the administration was going to do on TPS in this case and what exactly that TPS designation would do for hurricane victims here?
Sure. I think part of it was all of this came in a news cycle that followed news reports of Bahamians trying to get on a ferry to get off the island to come to the United States. And the rules for travel from Bahamas to the United States, you don't necessarily need a visa to come to the United States from the Bahamas, but you do need travel permission and a travel document if you are flying. mainly because we have an immigration inspection process in Nassau. So if you fly out of Nassau, you're inspected there before you get on the plane. And so we don't have quite as many documentary requirements. These people were trying to get on a boat, and just before the departure, the captain and the boat owners, at the request of CBP, the government suggested people didn't have documents to travel should get off. So the idea that TPS was somehow going to enable people to leave the island to come to the United States conflated the two issues. TPS would not have been a travel permission ongoing for people to come to the United States as refugees. TPS would have applied to people already here as of the time of the designation. It is a protected status. It protects you from deportation and removal. It is not an affirmative application you can use to come to the United States.
Has there been any precedent for something like that kind of travel permission?
Sure. The humanitarian parole is the kind of thing that we have available to us for people and individuals in situations. It is a case-by-case determination, and it can take a long time. It is also not permission for a massive exodus of people to come to the United States, but it can be used in individual circumstances to ask permission to come to the United States for humanitarian reasons. We've had granted humanitarian role in sort of a larger groups in the past, but again, I think there's not a specific sort of refugee open visa. I mean, in some ways, this relates back to our first topic, which is these people are fleeing a tragedy. They are refugees from a weather event, but it's not an asylum situation, but they are essentially in exactly the same position as people who are coming and asking for asylum or protection in the United States. Our system isn't exactly designed for this. We have mechanisms that can be used, and TPS is one of them for people already here, but this is one of those areas where maybe there's a reason to think more broadly about what granting protection to people who are fleeing some sort of situation means.
My last question for you is, you've been keen on this idea of an immigration FEMA, the idea that we need more flexibility in how our immigration system can respond to serious events. How would that concept come into play in a situation like this?
That's an interesting question. I think we had thought about it in the context of coordinating federal, local government responses to migration influxes along the border. Certainly, for example, if you had seen this boat with Bahamian refugees come and arrive in Florida, there'd be an opportunity for some sort of concerted whole of government effort to try to address their arrival. And we saw that, for example, in past with Haitians coming to Florida, and Cubans and others where we've had major migration events land on our shores. This was a sense of whether or not there is an opportunity for us to help people leave their situation and stay in the United States for some period of time while that situation is corrected in their home country. But because it's indefinite, our regular visa system just doesn't really operate that way. Is the U.S. government providing humanitarian assistance in the Bahamas? Yes, they are. They are already working with UN and other international organizations to try to address that. Obviously, a lot of nonprofit organizations and non-governmental organizations are heading to the Bahamas to address that as well. But I think our immigration system is not really equipped for this kind of a thing. I would also just make sure, because I think there may be some people still confused, contrast this with Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They are entitled to travel to the United States with just their documentation of their Puerto Rican nationality. So this is a different, Bahamas are not. They are foreign nationals. Immigration laws apply. So just want to clarify that for people thinking it's an island.
Theresa, Cris, I think that's a good place to leave it for this week. Thanks for joining me. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This episode of This Week in Immigration was written by Chris, Ramon, and myself and produced by Yafat Tawahara. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.